How's it going, my friends? On today's video, we're taking a look at two different major metropolitan areas, both of which I happen to be very familiar with. We're looking at the similarities, the differences, kind of all the stuff in between of the Twin Cities of Minnesota and Denver, Colorado. Maybe you are moving from one to the other. Maybe you're considering moving to either one. Both are an option. I got you. Stick around. How is it going, my friends? My name is Jesse Lynch, and I run the hardest working real estate team in the game. We're called To the Twin Cities, and you can check out our website, tothetwincities.com. But this YouTube channel is all about helping you find a place to call home, a place to land here in the beautiful Twin Cities of Minnesota. And that's whether you're buying a house for the first time or relocating here from a different city, state, country, planet, dimension, maybe both those things at the same time. So first-time home buyers and relocations, that is what we do, and that's what we do better than anybody else. So if either of those two things appeal to you, then do us both a favor, subscribe to the channel and click the bell to get notified so you can see every time we put these videos out. We do our best to have the most immersive, in-depth, honest, and just the best videos anywhere on the internet about what it's like to live here in the Twin Cities. So I think you'll be glad you did. And as always, if you wouldn't mind, while I have you here, if you'd give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment truly of any sort. I don't care what it is. You can literally comment, it's the one and only DOGG, and I will absolutely give that a thumbs up, heart emoji, and probably comment appropriately. What else would there be to comment? That engagement is helpful not only to this video and not just to this channel and this real estate team, but also to other people like yourselves who are thinking about moving here. So yeah. Do me that favor, and if you are one of those people who are thinking about moving here, then get a hold of us and we will crush it for you. Nobody will work harder for you. So you can go to our website, tothetwincities.com. We have a contact form there that you can fill out. It will literally take 15 seconds if you're ready to go. I think you should race. I think you should time it and see how fast you can do it. But I bet it could take 15 seconds if you really had your ducks in a row, Or you can shoot us an email directly to info@tothetwincities.com. They lead to the same inbox, so completely up to you. Feel free to take your time, though. It doesn't have to be 15 seconds. Today's video, we're talking two cities, and I happen to have a real estate team in both of them. I am from the Twin Cities. My girlfriend lives in Denver, so I happen to be in both quite frequently. And I have a team in both, and they are both respectively great cities. I'm excited to kind of talk through the differences of each one. And I'm gonna have this video on both channels. So if you happen to be one of the people who are thinking about moving to both, we'd love to help you in either one. Let's get into it, shall we? Okay, this video is gonna be a little bit off the cuff, a little bit casual, but I kind of want to just talk through what are the differences. I've spent a lot of time in both of these areas, and not only that, but I've also spent a lot of time in the rest of the country. I've toured the entire country. I travel quite a bit, and I think I have a pretty unique perspective and as good a frame of reference as you could possibly have on two areas. So I'm going to dive into that. What are the similarities? What are the differences? And to me, one thing that I find interesting is that the population of the Twin Cities greater metropolitan area is actually larger than the population of the Denver metropolitan area. Twin Cities metro is 3.6 million. Denver metro, according to this thing, is 2.9 million. I've seen higher numbers than that. I've seen closer to 3.4. So I don't know how that witchcraft gets figured out exactly, but I do think statistically, consistently, that's a funny sentence, that the Minneapolis, the Twin Cities metro is larger as far as population is concerned, and it sprawls quite a bit, right? So 3.6 million to 2.9 million for the metropolitan area. That said, I do think if you were to include maybe the Boulder or the Fort Collins metro, and then maybe the Colorado Springs, although I think undeniably that is a stretch to include in the Denver metro. I don't really think anybody is. I think there's a good argument that Boulder and Denver are kind of in the same metropolitan area, but not many people would say that. It's more of the Denver, Aurora, Lakewood metro, and then kind of all of the other areas around that. But there's less and less sort of rural land between Denver and Boulder. It's pretty consistently like populated. It does get a little bit sparse around Superior if you're heading towards Boulder. So yeah, there is like a little bit of a disconnect there, and still Boulder isn't that large. So I don't think that would really put that over the top of, you know, more population in the Denver metro, but interesting nonetheless. Whereas the Twin Cities, naturally, it's two cities. It's Minneapolis and St. Paul, which neither of which are particularly large, right? Collectively, they have a greater population than Denver proper, but I think individually on their own, neither one has a higher population than Denver. But they are right next to each other, whereas maybe Denver-Boulder is further apart, right? And then as far as the Twin Cities are concerned, you have the two major cities which are contiguous, right? They basically touch each other. They're divided by a river. And basically the whole metro just sprawls out from there, and it is consistent metro all the way out basically to the edges of the Metropolitan. Whereas the Denver metropolitan area, you will have like Denver, obviously there's a pretty big metropolitan area that is, you know, consistent throughout Denver, and then a little bit out through sort of the first ring suburbs. It doesn't take very long though in certain directions to hit a sort of like rural moment, right? Where there's like a disconnect from city to city, and it just feels like open space, which I'm neither saying is good nor bad, but more so to say that some things are a little more disjointed, right, from one sort of suburb to the next, whereas the Twin Cities, it's pretty much just a mass of suburb. So urban sprawl or whatever. But that's not to say that Denver doesn't have urban sprawl. It just is a little more spotty, right? A little more patchy in that regard. And then I'm going to start kind of in the city and kind of talk about things that are within the city specifically. And I think that Denver and the Twin Cities, I would say Minneapolis specifically, they are somewhat akin. They have similar vibes pretty consistently. That's not to say they're identical or anything like that, but they have a lot of things in common. Like, for example, both have a pretty strong sort of art scene, right? Arts community, music scene, music community. The Twin Cities and Denver both have pretty robust, like, professional sports teams, pretty much all of them, right? There's, for baseball, there's the Minnesota Twins, and there's Colorado Rockies. For football, there's the Denver Broncos and the Minnesota Vikings, which, boy, just a disappointing team to be a fan of. For hockey, there's the Minnesota Wild and the Colorado Avalanche. For basketball, there's the Denver Nuggets, the Minnesota Timberwolves. I don't know this sport as well, but both cities have a Major League Soccer team, an MLS team. And both cities, I would say, are pretty major stops as far as like entertainment tours and that kind of thing goes. I will say that I think Denver probably gets a tiny bit more as far as major tours stopping in Denver, just because of where they're situated geographically compared to the Twin Cities. The Twin Cities are a little bit more out of the way from, you know, maybe a metropolitan area like Chicago. You kind of have to go up, and then you're kind of at the end of the road, and then it's either back down or two smaller markets like maybe Fargo, maybe Omaha, something like that, right? Or maybe to Denver all the way, but either way, you're sort of going out of the way a little bit. So I think Denver gets a little bit more just for how it sits geographically. Both metropolitan areas do also have a pretty thriving sort of food scene, right? Restaurant scene, also a lot of breweries. Minnesota, I believe, makes more hops than any other state in the nation, but also Denver is super sort of beer heavy. Golden is home to, you know, the Coors Brewery, and there's microbreweries aplenty in both. So in this sort of like hipster brewery distillery kind of world, both are doing very, very well and are very, very similar in a lot of ways. Both have really cool downtowns with like pretty cool skylines, and also cool sort of, you know, downtown area municipal parks and that kind of thing. Both have sort of arts-based communities where Minneapolis, I would say Northeast is going to be one of the big sort of arts communities, whereas Denver, I would say, is going to be more like a Rhino Arts District, River North, or potentially some other neighborhoods, maybe like a Baker, something like that. 5 Points also a lot of sort of culture, and 5 Points also has a lot going on as well. Both metropolitan areas are somewhat diverse, but not extremely diverse, right? There's a lot of areas that are considerably more diverse than these two. Geographically, they are quite different. So just in terms of sort of topography, obviously Denver is very close to the mountains, but less close than a lot of people realize. For the most part, to get up into maybe like a ski slope, you're talking like an hour, right? Maybe an hour and a half to like a Vail or something like that. From downtown Denver to, you know, like a legit ski slope, hour on the fast end, and hour and a half probably more consistently, and then probably even more if you're going on a weekend and there's going to be traffic. But the city itself is very much in the plains, right? Once you get east of the Rocky Mountains, you have Denver, and then east of that is flat. It is very flat. It's basically Nebraska continued, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, very flat. As a person who has done the drive from Minneapolis to Denver, pretty boring east of Denver. Topographically, right? No shade on Nebraska intended. And naturally, Minnesota, also very flat. Nary a mountain in sight. We have some hills, right? Up north, there's Lutsen Mountain, not really a mountain, more like a big hill. I don't think it's tall enough to be considered a mountain. There's Speared Mountain. You know, basically these are ski hills, but debatably not mountains, right? Not actually a physical mountain in the whole state of Minnesota. That said, Minnesota is quite beautiful as well. Lakes, right? The land of 10,000 lakes, and there are a ton of lakes. There is water everywhere in Minnesota, which is one thing that when I go to Denver, I am struck by the lack of water, right? In Minnesota, where I grew up, there is water everywhere, and that is basically missing in Denver. And for the most part, when there is water in Colorado in general, it is a man-made lake, like a reservoir, right? And while I certainly appreciate the reservoirs and all that, and just the water, and of course there's like river, it is just a more arid climate, and obviously not all the lakes, but they have the mountains, so it's a trade-off, right? There's a more sort of deserty, arid climate to Denver, but you're very close to the mountains, you have views of mountains, and you have the access to, you know, the great skiing and snowboarding and such in the mountains, whereas Minnesota doesn't have mountains and certainly doesn't have any kind of oceans, but it is a very green, there's a lot of like park space and green space and trees with leaves and obviously lakes and all that. So that's about as different, in my opinion, as the two places get, is in terms of sort of the geography, the topography, and just how it looks, right? That is probably the greatest sort of dividing line between the two areas, basically, is that topography. And naturally, with some of that topography comes into play the weather. And I think the weather is something that when people think of cons about Minnesota, weather is like the number one thing that comes to mind. If you've seen the movie Fargo, then you know that it gets pretty cold, right? And for sure, it does get cold. And sometimes the thing where if you look like on a map and you look at like the averages, I don't think that necessarily is that helpful, because the averages are not the worst part of Minnesota, right? The extremes are the worst part of Minnesota. So on average, the coldest month of the year in Minnesota is January, and the average low temperature is 9 degrees in January in Minnesota. And that said, in the winter in Minnesota, we basically have a thing called a cold snap, where it just gets really cold all of a sudden, right? And we see some pretty extreme cold temperatures from time to time. It's not every day. It's, I mean, rarely every month. I would say in the winter, we have multiple below 0 days, right, Fahrenheit, where they are very, very cold. For the most part, it's going to be below freezing consistently. Like a 40-degree day in February feels like just a beautiful spring day because you're used to much colder weather. Whereas Denver doesn't get as cold and doesn't have that same cold snap, right? Where it's just like, holy cow. That's not to say every now and then Denver doesn't get some like extreme cold, but I would say their extreme cold is never as cold as Minnesota's extreme cold, right? I remember growing up in Minnesota having negative 45-degree wind chill days where school was canceled because there's negative 45-degree wind chill. That's brutal. I've never heard of Denver getting that cold ever. And the coldest month in Denver is December, which has a average low of 19 degrees, which again is more like 10 degrees higher than the coldest in Minnesota. But the warmest month for both is July. And Minnesota, the average high in July is 83, which is, if you ask me, is pretty nice. And the average high in Denver is 92. But something to consider there is that the humidity in Minnesota has a tendency to be considerably higher than the humidity in Denver. So again, it's more arid, it's going to be more deserty, but that said, it still is quite hot in Denver on very hot days. You're also closer to the sun, so sunburn is pretty legitimate in Denver, whereas Minnesota, you're sea level basically, and while you do get humidity and you get some very like muggy days, which is a very Minnesotan thing to say, it does get up to 100, from time to time. Every now and then you'll get, 100-degree plus weather in Minnesota, but I would say it's fairly rare in Denver as well, but it does happen. Interestingly though, both places get snow. That's probably pretty obvious. But the snow behaves very, very differently in both areas. Denver actually gets more snow on average annually than Minneapolis does, but that is like almost hard to believe because there is more snow on the ground, I would say, on average in Minnesota, which might seem counterintuitive, but the reason for it is that when it snows in Minnesota, typically the first snowfall is going to be, November. That might be the first inkling of snow, but often kind of when it really starts to stick is going to be more around December. But typically, I said when it sticks, right? Once it snows in Minnesota, usually it's cold enough that snow will exist and will sit there throughout the entire winter. So you'll have snow in your yard, in the parks, etc., from the first legit cold snowfall through the end of winter, whereas Denver gets more snow at 60 inches, which, by the way, sorry for tangenting, Minnesota gets 52 inches annually of snow. Denver 60, but Denver is basically just hey, here's a ton of snow, and then that melts, a week later on average. It's not to say it can't stick around. Side note, I literally had somebody call me to tell me that in one of my videos I said snow doesn't stick, and they were like, snow sticks sometimes. Okay, yeah, I know, but for the most part, it doesn't stick around all winter, at least not as long as it does in Minnesota. So for the most part, it snows, it's gone in a week or so, right? Whereas Minnesota, it hangs out all the time. So yeah, I would say the average amount of snow on the ground, higher in Minnesota, but average snowfall higher in Denver. Something interesting, and the powder is different. It tends to be a drier, more powdery snow in Denver than Minnesota. Minnesota tends to be a little bit of a wetter snow than, because it's a somewhat more humid climate. Now here's an area where it starts to get, I think, kind of interesting, and that's sort of the economics of the two areas. I think both areas have very robust economies. Minnesota has more Fortune 500 companies than any other state in the nation, But Denver is doing very, very well and attracting a lot of like tech and sort of startups and stuff. So I think both, it's almost a tie for economics as far as just like, you know, bringing people in and want, you know, being a desirable place economically. Now, Minnesota has a higher tax rate, income tax rate, than Denver. But Minnesota's income tax rate is 7.1%, whereas Denver's is 4.8%. And property taxes in the Twin Cities are also higher than property taxes in Denver. Denver typically is somewhere going to be around like 0.6, 0.7%, something like that, of the value of the home, sort of the assessed value of the home is going to be something like 6 or 7%. Twin Cities is 1.1%, which at face value seems like, wow, you're kind of getting ripped off in the Twin Cities. However, home prices are considerably cheaper in the Twin Cities than they are in Denver. About half, right? So yeah, you almost are paying similar amounts of taxes on your home, but your home on median is going to cost almost double in Denver as it will in the Twin Cities. Twin Cities median home price right now is sitting around $350,000, whereas the Denver metropolitan area, it's sitting around $650,000. So statistically speaking, the Twin Cities are more affordable than Denver, but there are certain little things, right? Like the income tax, like the property taxes, where Denver kind of starts to make its way back. But ultimately, the housing costs are going to be considerably higher. Rent costs are going to be more expensive as well if you happen to be somebody who's thinking about renting. If you are thinking about renting, by the way, side note, if it's possible for you to buy, I generally think that's a good idea, and not just because I'm a real estate agent and would like to help you buy, but because I just kind of can see where things are headed right now, and it's not towards being more affordable to anybody. Speaking of buying a home, what kind of housing stock are we talking about? What are the houses like in each area? For the most part, fairly similar, but there are some distinct differences. The first of which is that Minnesota, the Twin Cities, specifically St. Paul, has a proclivity of being older, right? Some of the oldest houses in Minnesota are in St. Paul because it was the first of the two Twin Cities, and they're in like the 1870s, maybe, is some of the oldest stuff that's around. That's an old house. It's 150 years old. That's definitely very old. You're not going to see that pretty much ever in Denver. It is just a newer city, so for the most part, the like historic homes in the city are just going to be at least post 1900, and yeah, typically a bit newer. One thing that Denver you'll see way more often in Denver is brick homes, and if you do, very often they're like a yellow brick, and that's the world famous Chaska yellow brick. You see red brick here too, but for whatever reason, that was a thing, that was a phase. But for the most part, and I would guess something to do with the weather and whatever the conditions, you are less likely to see a brick home in the Twin Cities as you are in Denver. Also, statistically, you're more likely to find a basement in the Twin Cities than Denver. That said, a lot of homes have basements in Denver, but it's like 99% of homes have basements in the Twin Cities, and slightly less than that have them in Denver. There's also the concept of a scrape, which I probably have talked about on both channels. They're basically when somebody takes an old home that maybe is in disrepair, maybe not, maybe it just happens to be sitting on a great piece of land, and they scrape it, right? They demolish it and they put up a new home. That's kind of what's known as a scrape. You are way more likely to see that in Denver, especially Denver proper, than you are in Minneapolis proper. The places that you might see it in Minneapolis are, it's becoming slightly more common, but still way less common. I would say southwest Minneapolis, adjacent to Edina, you're way more likely to see a scrape. Some over by Nokomis you might see, and some in northeast you might see. But aside from southwest Minneapolis, I would say it's less of like a tactic and more of just like a home is in really rough shape, so they demo it, tear it down, and put something else up. Again, you're more likely to see a brick craftsman. You're more likely to see a four square also, which is like kind of just a box house where it's like exactly square. You're more likely to see those in Denver, whereas in the Twin Cities, I think you're more likely to see bungalows, like 1.5-story bungalows that are more like a wood siding or a shake or something like that. For whatever reason, it's probably weather related if I had to guess. But yeah, that you're just more likely to see those. And then as you start to sort of move out from the cities, the houses tend to get pretty similar. You're more likely to see sort of a Spanish type of home in Denver, and that is pretty uncommon in the Twin Cities. You're more likely to see a tiled roof than you are in the Twin Cities. Those are quite rare in the Twin Cities. They do exist, but they're quite rare and tend to be on more like specific streets, like a parkway or something like that, right? Fancier, sort of like a Summit Avenue, maybe like a Mississippi Boulevard, something like that. You might see something more extravagant that has a tile roof. But again, I think just because of the weather, tile roofs don't exactly do that well in Minnesota. So you just are way less likely to see them. You're way more likely to see a brownstone apartment in Minneapolis than you are in Denver. Not to say that they don't exist in Denver, but they're way more common. Like when I think of a brownstone, and maybe you're like, what's a brownstone? It's like, if I think about New York, if I think about like a Brooklyn maybe, that's like just like a brick, largely like brick apartment building. Often it's going to have sort of like craftsman details inside with like, big chunky trim, maybe like hardwood floors and that kind of thing. You're more likely to see those in Minneapolis than you are in Denver, although they do exist in Denver. And back to the suburbs, the new build homes tend to be pretty similar from Denver to Minneapolis. I think for the most part, just like building practices are kind of getting narrowed in on what works and what doesn't. But that's not to say that there aren't going to be some differences, between the two. And then lastly, I think I've noticed you're less likely to see like a modern aesthetic in the Twin Cities as you are in Denver. That said, there are some amazing sort of modern homes in the Twin Cities, but there's just a higher level of them in Denver. A lot of that I think has to do with the scrape and has to do with folks coming from out of state, tearing something down, putting something up. Whereas Minnesota, a lot of the historic homes really have retained a lot of their quality and are still in really, really good shape. And obviously, you're way more likely to find a lake home in Minnesota as you are in Denver, which is very much like a thing. The wanting a lake home is very much a thing that people want here, so they're very sought after. They're not exactly cheap, but because we have so many lakes, it is a lot easier to find, whereas that's not really a thing, in Denver. There's very few. And so what does it take to get a home? Like, what kind of prices are we talking? For a starter home in Denver, like realistically, we're talking $400-ish, right? That's kind of what we're seeing people buy for like a beginner first-time home buyer home, is around the $400,000 mark. In the Twin Cities, I hesitate to say $250,000. That is probably the barrier for entry, but there are not very many homes for $250,000. So realistically, I would say $300,000. $300,000 is a very common pre-approval amount in the Twin Cities. And it is definitely possible to get a home there, although it is a very, very competitive part of the market. And if it's $250,000, yeah, you can. Townhome, of course, you can get less than that. That's true of Denver as well. $400,000. A lot of times what we're seeing is like townhomes and that kind of stuff. And then as far as new builds are concerned, you'll see new build homes in Denver advertised at $400,000, but that's kind of like a get your attention number. And we're rarely seeing any of them actually close at $400,000, right? So there's usually a bunch of other fees, design fees, and like additional add-ons that most people are adding. So $450,000, something like that, as like the barrier for entry on a new build for a single family home. Townhomes are pretty popular in Denver, especially in Denver proper, actually. You'll see a lot more townhomes in Denver proper than you will see townhomes in the Twin Cities, in like the proper Twin Cities. And just because of the density, and it's more of, they're kind of going for that sort of lifestyle. And they're scraping homes and putting up, 3-4 unit townhomes in place. really nice modern stuff, but that's kind of an interesting contrast as well. And for the most part, if you want a townhome in the Twin Cities metro, you have to go to the suburbs. Again, not to say that there's not some in the cities, but most of them are going to be, just outside at least first ring suburbs. And I feel like you really started to see more townhomes once you kind of get out to the second ring and third ring suburbs, just because, I don't know, trends, and that's kind of when stuff was being made, A new build in the Twin Cities is going to be right around that $400,000 mark as well, and it's going to be usually in sort of a third ring suburb, because the Twin Cities very much are just expanding this way, and the sort of path of progress is kind of out on the edge, right? So the newest homes, for the most part, are being built around the edge. So yeah, if you want a new build, especially an affordable one, you're going to kind of have to go out here, and that's really that $400,000 mark. But you get a really great home, a lot of yard, and yeah, typically nice neighborhood. As far as like a luxury home in Minnesota probably starts somewhere around $800,000. A luxury home in Denver is almost double that, probably 1.5 million, maybe. You start to get into like a luxury category. So like a lake home in Minnesota, you can find them for, I hesitate to say 500,000, maybe 600,000 is where a lake home would begin. And then if you not counting like a lake home, luxury homes, like really, really nice homes seem to start around 800,000, which is also actually where the market sort of begins to like soften, right? There's just less competition above 800,000 in the Twin Cities, whereas in Denver, that number is considerably higher. In the 1.4 maybe is where you kind of start to see it slow down a little bit. Schools, okay, as far as schools are concerned, public schools on average are going to be a little bit better in Minnesota than they are in Denver. That's not to say there aren't good schools in Denver. There definitely are, but more consistently, and partly because there are more suburbs and just a lot of area in the Twin Cities, there are more schools, and so there are more highly rated schools. And then kind of the last thing really that I can think to talk about would be the traffic. And this is the kind of thing where I always say, if you're coming from LA or San Francisco or New York or maybe even Seattle, the traffic in both is going to feel fantastic to you, right? That said, if you're coming from Denver to the Twin Cities, then you might think, wow, there's like no traffic in the Twin Cities. And if you're coming from the Twin Cities to Denver, you might find that the traffic is a bit intense for you. So that is to say that the traffic is a bit worse in Denver than it is in Minnesota. I would say on average, right? Pretty consistently, it's going to be a little higher. But with one major caveat, which is that if there's a big snowstorm in Minnesota, the traffic can get pretty horrendous. Your half-hour commute could turn into a 2-hour commute. But again, it's not quite that much snow in Minnesota. Not as much as it seems. It's just that there is always snow on the ground. And then kind of on the same traffic and snow-related subject, Minnesota, in my opinion, is a little bit better at clearing snow than Denver when it snows. They're better at plowing, and my assumption is because it's cold and it's going to stick around longer, and they know that, so they have to clear it right away. Denver, I think, is a little bit more laissez-faire and thinking like, well, it's going to melt soon anyway, so if they don't get to it, that's not the end of the world. You're way more likely to see like a residential road in Denver that is like pitted out with snow following a snowstorm, whereas you kind of only ever see that in Minnesota in like the alleys, right? So that's it. That's all I got. One last thing. Weed's legal in Colorado, not in Minnesota. So do with that what you will. And as always, if you are thinking about moving to the Twin Cities in Minnesota, then get a hold of us and we will absolutely crush it for you. You can go to our website, tothetwincities.com. We have a contact form there that you can fill out, or you can shoot us an email directly to info@tothetwincities.com. The choice is yours. They lead to the same inbox, so we have very little preference, but those are our two preferred ways that you reach out. There are other ways to reach out on other videos, but very much these days, the website and that email address are our preferred methods for you to reach out, just out of simplicity and not, missing things, right? And as always, if you're new here, if you have not done so yet, subscribe to the channel and click the bell to get notified so you can see every time we put out these Tremendous videos. And if you wouldn't mind giving the video a thumbs up and leaving a comment of any sort, I would truly appreciate it. It'd feel good for my ego. Also, I spent a lot of time doing this, so I would appreciate that so much, and it's also helpful to other folks like yourself. I hope this video has been helpful. This is actually a requested video, so not just me trying to like cross-promote things. I just happen to be able to speak pretty fluently on the issue. I'm probably going to do more of these. I'm curious, leave in the comment. For one, leave anything that I didn't cover that you're like, hey, you missed this, or hey, you're wrong about this. You know, whatever. It's possible I'm wrong about some things. But I'd love to know that, but I'd also love to know if there are any other cities that you'd like for me to compare. Statistically, or just, you know, I've been to a lot of places. So, yeah. Any others? All right. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.